They reported it as a threat, but what happened inside that room was something far more calculated and far more dangerous for Nigerian opposition politics than anyone is admitting. Less than 10 days after Peter Obi stood on a stage in Abuja and announced Rabiu Musa Kwankwasiyya as his running mate for the 2027 presidential election, the single most significant opposition announcement in this election cycle, Kwankwasiyya was reportedly threatening to walk out of the very party that made that ticket possible. Not in private, not in whispers, on the record, in documents copied to the party's national leader. Now, the Kwankwasiyya Movement has since denied the threat. The NDC national leadership has stayed conspicuously quiet, and the Nigerian media has been left arguing over whether this was a crisis, a negotiation tactic, or a manufactured storm. But here is the question nobody is asking clearly enough. Why does this keep happening? And what does it tell us about whether this opposition ticket can survive the road to 2027? Stay with me, because what looks like a dispute over a candidate's list in Kano is actually a window into a much deeper structural problem in Nigerian opposition politics. And by the time we are done, you will understand exactly why the Obi-Kwankwaso ticket may be its own biggest threat. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Naija Insight Desk exists for one reason: to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now, because this conversation is about to get deeper. Let us reconstruct the timeline precisely, because the chronology here is not accidental. On the 28th and 29th of May 2026, the Nigeria Democratic Congress, the NDC, conducted nationwide primary elections to select candidates for federal and state House of Assembly seats ahead of the 2027 general elections. The NDC is barely 3 months old as a registered party, having been formally incorporated on the 23rd of February 2026. On the 30th of May, just one day after those primaries, Peter Obi was confirmed as the NDC's presidential flag-bearer at a special convention in Abuja. Moments later, he announced Rabiu Musa Kwankwasiyya as his running mate. Kwankwasiyya accepted. He tweeted his gratitude the following morning, calling it a profound honor. So far, so clean. Then, within days of that announcement, a document signed by the Kano State NDC chairman, Hussaini Isa Mairiga, began circulating. That document revised the list of candidates who had emerged from the Kano primaries. It replaced candidates from the Kwankwasiyya bloc, Kwankwasso's political movement, across multiple federal constituency and state assembly seats, including Kumbotso, Nasarawa, Kano Municipal, Dala, Tarauni, and Dawakin Kudu. The stated justification was there was a pre-existing power-sharing agreement between the Kwankwasiyya Movement and the original NDC structure in Kano. The formula was 60-40, 60% of party tickets to Kwankwasiyya, 40% to the legacy NDC structure. The Kano chairman's position was that the initial list submitted by Kwankwasso's camp did not accurately reflect this formula, so corrections were necessary. Kwankwasso's camp saw it differently. Their argument was that the primaries were conducted properly with INEC present and that the candidates who emerged did so through a legitimate process. To replace them after the fact, they said, was a breach of trust and a violation of the terms on which the Kwankwasiyya Movement had joined the NDC. Multiple media houses then reported that Kwankwasiyya had threatened to leave the party. The reports were specific enough to include details. He would pull the Kwankwasiyya structure out of the NDC if the substitutions were allowed to stand. The Kwankwasiyya Movement spokesman, Habibu Mohammed, then put out a flat denial. Kwankwasiyya never threatened to leave the NDC. Neither the Kwankwasiyya Movement nor its leader is complaining. Simultaneously, Northwest NDC leaders were accusing Kwankwasiyya in the opposite direction, alleging that he had demanded complete authority over the party's Kano operations and that anyone who was not a member of his movement was effectively being shut out of the nomination process. So, we now have three competing narratives in play at the same time. One,
Kwankwaso threatened because his candidates were replaced. 2. Kwankwaso never threatened anything. The story is fabricated. 3. Kwankwasiyya himself is the aggressor, trying to seize total control of the NDC in Kano. Here is the first thing you need to understand. All three of these can be partially true simultaneously, and that's precisely what makes this story revealing. Before we get to what is really driving this conflict, I want you to hold one question in the back of your mind. This is the third major party Kwankwaso has entered and destabilized in less than 3 years. What does his track record actually tell us about this alliance and whether any Nigerian party can truly absorb the Kwankwasiyya structure without fracturing?
To understand this dispute properly, we need to understand the legal and institutional framework inside which it is playing out, because there are at least 3 separate institutional failures happening simultaneously within the NDC right now. The first failure: the primary election results have not been officially released. The NDC conducted its nationwide primaries on May 28th and 29th. As of 10 days after that exercise, the official results had still not been announced publicly. The party issued a statement telling Nigerians to disregard results circulating on social media and said results would be released only when the candidate list was submitted to INEC. A NEC meeting was convened, initially scheduled for the 3rd of June, to ratify outcomes. This is not a minor administrative detail. Under the Electoral Act 2022, parties are required to conduct primaries in a manner that allows INEC to observe and certify the process. When results are withheld from public knowledge while internal revisions are being made, as appears to be happening in Kano, it creates a legitimacy gap that any candidate whose ticket is altered can exploit in court. The NDC's own national leader, Senator Seriake Dickson, acknowledged this directly at the party's second NEC meeting, noting that, and I am paraphrasing, while the NDC is barely 3 months old and has moved at a remarkable speed, a few complaints from the primary exercise were not unexpected. A party that is simultaneously managing a presidential primary, national candidate primaries, and the integration of 2 massive political structures, the Kwankwasiyya Movement and the legacy NDC, within 3 months of registration, is running governance at an extremely high operational risk. Something was always going to crack. The question was where. The second failure: the 60-40 power-sharing arrangement was never formalized in a manner that gave it enforceable legal status. Political power-sharing deals in Nigeria are almost always oral or documented only in internal party memos. They are not legally enforceable contracts. When the Kano NDC chairman revised the candidate list and cited the 60-40 formula as his justification, he was invoking a political agreement, not a constitutional or statutory obligation. This is the deliberate ambiguity that Nigerian party politics thrives on. The same deal can be interpreted as 60% of all positions go to Kwankwasiyya by one side and 60% of positions after internal party consensus by the other, and both readings are defensible because nothing was codified with sufficient precision. Who benefits from that ambiguity? The party establishment does, because it means the final call on candidate lists rests with whoever controls the internal process, not the candidate's movement. The third failure: the NDC's internal dispute resolution mechanism appears to have broken down before it was fully tested. Senator Seriake Dickson, who functions as the party's national leader and founder, reportedly attempted reconciliation between the 2 factions. Those attempts had not produced a resolution by the time media reports of Kwankwaso's alleged threat went public. This matters institutionally. A political party that cannot resolve a candidate list dispute involving its own vice presidential nominee less than 10 days after a presidential ticket announcement has a governance problem that no amount of media management can conceal. Let me be precise about something here. The NDC is a new party. New parties have teething problems, but the specific nature of this problem, power-sharing disputes, candidate substitutions, withheld results, competing narratives, is not a teething problem. It is a structural fault line that was always going to emerge once Kwankwaso joined.
Here's a detail that very few people are discussing. The NDC was founded on 23 February 2026. By May 3rd, that is 69 days, two of Nigeria's most prominent opposition politicians had joined, and one of them had been made the presidential candidate. By May 30th, day 97, a presidential ticket had been announced. By June 8th, day 106, that ticket was already in crisis over a candidate list. 106 days from incorporation to internal rupture. That's the speed at which Nigerian opposition politics moves, and that's the speed at which it unravels.
Let us now take this up a level, because the implications of NDC instability extend beyond the interests of Obi and Kwankwasiyya. Nigeria's democratic trajectory depends in part on viable opposition. This is not rhetoric, it is a structural reality. In any functioning democracy, the credibility of opposition is part of what disciplines the governing party. An APC that faces no serious electoral threat has less institutional incentive to deliver on governance. The weakening of opposition is, in that sense, a weakening of accountability. The NDC is currently the most visible opposition vehicle for the 2027 presidential race. The PDP is internally fragmented. The Labour Party is still recovering from its post-2023 legal battles. The NNPP is a shell after Kwankwaso's departure. The ADC is legally compromised. If the NDC also fractures or arrives at the 2027 election as a weakened, internally divided coalition, Nigerian voters face a scenario where the incumbent is effectively unchallenged at the presidential level. That matters for every Nigerian below the poverty line, for every young person who turned out in record numbers in 2023, and for every Nigerian watching their naira lose value, their security deteriorate, and their institutions weaken. The Kano dimension. Kano is not just any state. It is Nigeria's second-largest city, the commercial capital of the north, and a state whose political allegiances have historically shaped national electoral outcomes. Kwankwasiyya's organizational depth in Kano, its ward-level structure, its scholarship recipients, its deeply loyal grassroots base, represents the kind of political machine that is rare in Nigerian politics outside the ruling party. If this alliance fractures or if Kwankwaso's control of his base is weakened by internal NDC infighting, the political landscape of Kano becomes genuinely unpredictable ahead of 2027. Governor Abba Yusuf has already defected to the APC, multiple NNPP lawmakers followed. The APC is actively consolidating in Kano. If Kwankwaso loses coherence within the NDC, the APC gains a clear path to dominance in a state it has historically struggled to hold. The question of democratic consolidation. There is a broader institutional argument here that I want you to consider. Nigerian opposition politics has now passed through the Labour Party, the NNPP, the ADC, and the NDC in the space of roughly 3 years, driven by the same core personalities, the same unresolved tensions around leadership and control, and the same structural weakness: the inability to build party institutions that outlast the individuals inside them. This is not Kwankwaso's failure alone. It is not Obi's failure alone. It is a systemic failure of Nigerian political party architecture, in which parties are built as personal vehicles rather than institutional structures, and coalitions are assembled through elite bargaining rather than shared governance ideology. Until that changes, every opposition cycle will look like this one: hope, announcement, internal crisis, fragmentation. A quick word on the international frame, because this story lands differently outside Nigeria's borders. For Africa watchers and democratic observers, the NDC story is a case study in a tension that is playing out across the continent, the tension between movement politics and party institutionalization. The Kwankwasiyya Movement is in many ways a prototype of what political scientists call a personalized mass movement, a highly loyal, deeply organized following built around a single charismatic figure rather than an ideology or a platform. You see this model across West Africa. You saw it with Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire, with Condé in Guinea, with Rawlings in Ghana. These movements are extraordinarily effective at mobilization. They are also extraordinarily difficult to integrate into multi-faction coalition structures because their loyalty is to a person, not to a party.
The challenge for the NDC is the same challenge every Nigerian party faces when absorbing a movement. How do you integrate a structure built around personal loyalty into a collective governance framework without either destroying the movement's cohesion or allowing it to overwhelm the party's institutional identity? For Nigerians in the diaspora, in the UK, the US, Canada, South Africa, this moment matters because 2027 is being positioned as a consequential election on questions that diaspora Nigerians care deeply about: economic management, institutional reform, security, and the question of whether Nigeria is governable at all. A credible opposition that can sustain itself through to the election matters for that argument. Let me steelman the strongest argument against the analysis I have just presented, because intellectual honesty demands it. Argument 1. Kwankwasiyya is being unfairly targeted. The strongest version of this argument goes like this. Kwankwasiyya brought the most organized political structure in the north into an alliance with Peter Obi. Without Kwankwasiyya, the NDC's northern presence is thin. It is entirely reasonable for a movement that contributed disproportionately to an alliance to expect that its candidates are protected. The candidate substitutions were not routine administration, they were a provocation. And calling out that provocation is not destabilization, it is the exercise of a legitimate contractual expectation. This is a real argument and it deserves to be taken seriously. Power-sharing deals are the foundation of coalition politics everywhere in the world. When they are violated or appear to be violated, the aggrieved party has every right to object loudly. The reporting of Kwankwasiyya's alleged threat may itself have been a strategic leak designed to force the NDC national leadership to intervene and restore the original candidate list. In that reading, this was a negotiating maneuver, not a genuine exit threat. Misconception 1. This is just about ego. Much of the social media commentary on this story has reduced it to a clash of egos between powerful men. That framing misses the institutional stakes entirely. This dispute is about the distribution of electoral resources, candidate tickets, which are the currency of political power in Nigeria. It is about whether the 60-40 formula is legally binding or politically negotiable. It is about whether INEC-observed primaries can be retrospectively revised by a state party chairman's memo. These are not ego questions, they are governance questions. Misconception 2. The NDC denial resolves the crisis. It does not. A spokesman denying that his principal threatened to leave a party does not tell us what the principal actually said in closed-door negotiations. It tells us what the public position is. The underlying tension over candidate control in Kano remains unresolved as of today, until official results are submitted to INEC and the final candidate list for Kano is published. This dispute is suspended, not settled.
3 most likely trajectories from here. Scenario 1. Negotiated settlement, surface unity restored. The most probable short-term outcome. The NDC national leadership, led by Dixon, brokers a revised candidates list that gives the Kwankwasiyya bloc enough of its positions to satisfy the movement without completely invalidating the original revision. Both sides declare victory privately and peace publicly. The Obi-Kwankwaso ticket proceeds intact. This scenario preserves the alliance for now, but does not resolve the underlying structural tension. The next crisis will be triggered by a different episode, perhaps governorship ticket allocation, perhaps campaign resource distribution, and it will unfold faster than this one because the precedent of managed crisis will have normalized the pattern. Scenario 2, Kwankwasiyya exits or reduces his engagement. A lower probability but non-trivial outcome. If the candidate substitutions are allowed to stand in their entirety, if the Kwankwasiyya bloc is effectively overruled, Kwankwasiyya faces a credibility problem within his own movement. To remain on a ticket that cannot guarantee his candidate's protection in his home state would signal weakness. Some in the movement would begin quietly exploring alternatives. We have seen this dynamic before. In 2023, when Governor Abba Yusuf's gradual distancing from Kwankwasiyya presaged his full defection to the APC. The lesson is that Kwankwasiyya exoduses happen incrementally before they happen decisively.
If Kwankwaso exits, the Obi-Kwankwaso project loses its northern anchor and becomes a regional ticket without a credible national coalition story. That would effectively cede the north to Tinubu and the APC. Scenario 3, the crisis becomes a legal battle. Given the NDC's failure to publicly release primary results over 10 days after the exercise, and given the involvement of INEC observers in the original primaries, any candidate whose ticket was altered has a plausible legal case under the Electoral Act. If Kwankwasiyya candidates file court actions challenging their substitution, the NDC enters 2027 campaigning while simultaneously managing litigation, the same fate that destroyed the ADC and the NNPP before it. Signals to watch. Watch for the official INEC filing from the NDC, the formal submission of the candidates list. That document will tell you whether the substitutions stood or were reversed. Watch for any public statement from Kwankwasiyya himself, not his spokesman. His personal silence or his personal speech will be the most reliable indicator of the alliance's real temperature. And watch Kano. If Kwankwasiyya ward-level structures begin relocating their activities outside the NDC framework, holding parallel meetings, organizing independently, that is the early warning sign that the movement is preparing a strategic exit regardless of what any spokesman says. 12-month outlook. If the alliance holds and the candidate list dispute is resolved through negotiation, the Obi-Kwankwaso ticket enters the formal campaign season intact and retains its positioning as the most credible presidential challenge to Tinubu. That does not guarantee electoral success. The APC's incumbency advantages and the PDP's national infrastructure remain formidable, but it preserves the possibility of a genuinely competitive race. If the alliance fractures, the 2027 election becomes a virtual walkover for Tinubu, and the NDC joins the growing list of opposition vehicles that arrived with promise and dissolved under the weight of unresolved structural contradictions. There is one figure in this story who has said almost nothing publicly: Peter Obi. He announced the ticket, he accepted the nomination, and since the crisis erupted, he has been silent. That silence is a strategic choice. Obi knows better than anyone that his value proposition to Nigerian voters is his image as a disciplined, above-the-fray leader. Weighing in publicly on an internal party dispute would shatter that image, but silence has its own cost. It allows a narrative of NDC chaos to fill the vacuum. Every day he does not speak, the crisis defines his ticket instead of his candidacy defining the crisis. At the beginning of this video, I asked you a specific question. Why does this keep happening? And what does it tell us about whether this opposition ticket can survive the road to 2027? Here is my answer. This keeps happening because Nigerian opposition politics has not yet solved the foundational problem of how to build a party that is bigger than the individuals inside it. Every coalition that has formed around the anti-Tinubu project has been held together by elite bargaining and personal ego calculations rather than shared institutional architecture. When those calculations shift, as they always eventually do, the coalition fractures. The Obi-Kwankwaso ticket is not immune to this dynamic. In fact, it faces an intensified version of it because both principals are former presidential candidates who accepted a hierarchical relationship, Obi as president, Kwankwaso as deputy, that requires sustained mutual restraint to function. That restraint is now being tested not in an actual presidential campaign, but in an internal candidate list dispute in Kano. If they cannot manage this, the stress of an actual presidential campaign will be exponentially more difficult to navigate. What the NDC needs to survive as a credible vehicle is exactly what Nigerian opposition politics has historically been unable to deliver: an institutional framework that supersedes personal loyalty, a transparent dispute resolution mechanism, and leadership with the discipline to enforce agreements in public, not just celebrate them. Whether Seriake Dixon, Peter Obi, and Rabiu Musa Kwankwaso are capable of building that, together, inside a party that is barely 4 months old, is the question that will determine whether the most significant opposition announcement of this election cycle becomes a footnote or a turning point. I do not have the answer to that yet. And frankly, neither does anyone else. What I know is this: the signals will come from Kano. Watch Kano.
If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.